Greetings and welcome to the Center for Global Development. I'm really excited to have the opportunity today to have this conversation with Susanna Moorehead, the outgoing chair of the DAC, the Development Assistance Committee, and in the interests of full disclosure, I should say, a longtime friend and a colleague when we used to work together many years ago. So Susanna, welcome to CGD. It's a great pleasure to have you here. You've been now at the DAC coming up to 4 years. That's the term as the chair. And I thought we might start really by asking you what you felt were, during this period, the things where things have moved well forward, and looking back on that period, you feel good about them. And what are the things where you sort of look back and say, I wish we could have done a bit more on this, or not sure we're in a very good place on that?
Well, thank you for having me, Masood. Always a pleasure to see you. Let me start with what I think has worked. Start on a positive note. I think in the declaration that we agreed just in advance of COP26, we tried to do two things. One was to demonstrate that for DAC members, it's a false dichotomy to choose between poverty and climate change. They're two sides of the same coin. And the second was to put far more focus on the need to support adaptation, particularly in low-income countries and small island developing states. Secondly, I would say that the center of gravity of the Committee on Modernization has shifted. So there is a far more incremental but reforming mood in the committee. And let me give you an example. When I arrived, there was still a very active debate as to whether grants were always better than loans, no matter what. And I think it's now been accepted that it's not that one is intrinsically good and the other bad. Loans can be a very appropriate instrument. It depends on what you're lending for, what the debt position is, what the terms are, and that they're done openly and transparently. Thirdly, we have widened the tent. I mean, you and many others often criticize the DAC for being a sort of rich man's club sitting in Paris. Well, we have more women than men on the DAC at the moment, but we have massively increased our outreach to civil society, to partners, to non-DAC donors, to the private sector, other parts of the multilateral system. It's still work in progress, but I do feel actually one of perhaps the benefits of COVID was it enabled us to reach far more people online than we had done in the past. I'm particularly proud of having the first international standard on trying to stamp out sexual abuse and harassment in the aid sector. Again, that's a cultural change. It's going to take time, but we do have a recommendation, and we keep pressure up on members to implement that. The Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus, which is a fancy way of saying make sure that you join up the different parts of your interventions, has now entered the lexicon of development and the multilateral system. I mean, no matter where I go, people are talking about the nexus. There's more to be done, but we launched a Nexus Academy with the United Nations last year, which is the hallmark of the DAC, peer learning, sharing what works and what doesn't. And I suppose last but not least, ODA has continued to go up. Of course, it hasn't gone up nearly as fast as demand, but the trajectory is still in the right direction. And in Paris, we've managed to keep what I think of as the exoskeleton of the DAC, not just going, but going from strength to strength. So the policy networks, the ODA statistics, the peer reviews, the things that make the DAC unique. So that's quite a long list of successes.
All the things that have gone well.
So
tell me, what do you feel? Maybe, we should have done a little bit more on.
Okay. This could be equally long. I still think we are not succeeding in making the case for development among the publics and the taxpayers persuasive enough. And the headwinds, as you know, have been strong in the opposite direction. But we've done a number of reports. We have our development cooperation report coming out next month that is exploring why it is such a contested space now. But we need to convince the public. We need to try and get to a place where everyone understands that this is not optional, that this is an investment in everyone's future. But that's been hard. We haven't done as well as I would have liked on rising odor levels. I mean, speaking in a personal capacity, because the committee didn't agree with me, I said that I thought odor for Ukraine should be additional. That I didn't think it was right that poor people in partner countries should be the hidden victims of Russian aggression. We don't yet know precisely how much odor will go to Ukraine, but in an almost flat odor world, more for humanitarian or more for Ukraine inevitably means less for development. So we haven't made as much progress there. I think in terms of the nexus, we should have injected far more politics and diplomacy into making that work. So it's not just about linking humanitarian development and peace activities. There needs to be far more politics and to use our diplomatic networks. On global public goods, we have a very long way to go. I mean, we've set out the level of ambition on climate, but of course that's not the only one. And the committee has not yet agreed on what role odor should play in that. I'm sure we'll come back to that. And the private sector, we talk an awful lot about needing to get more private sector investment into developing countries. We published guidance on blended finance, but it remains a very, very small part of the overall effort, and we have to do more.
So that's a big agenda, as you say. And in a way, this is always going to be a work in progress, because the way we think about development, the way we think about development cooperation changes. And so both the definitions of odor and the ways in which it is used, and therefore the work of the DAC, all evolve over time. Now, one thing you just said, we haven't been able to convince people enough of the merits of development assistance. And I want to drill down a little bit on that, because you could say, on the one hand, there are many challenges that are coming up, which are newer challenges, and the more ODA is seen to be able to respond to those challenges, which are very much on the minds of people, that should help to make the case for ODA and for development assistance. On the other hand, you could say, well, using development assistance in ways that are different from what used to be seen as the primary purpose, which is to help countries develop, actually makes people skeptical of the value of it, undermines it. So you have countries, Sweden, UK, a number of countries, they're all using fairly large chunks of their ODA to finance the cost of hosting refugees for the first year. That's allowed under the ODA rules. But a lot of people, when they read this, find out about this, they actually say, well, that's really not what ODA should be about. And so in your mind, how do you think about the balance between whether being, I was going to say flexible, but whether being ready to accommodate the pressures on ODA and allowing some of those pressures to be reflected in ODA helps to make the case for development, or does it actually undermine the case for development?
I think it does both,
yes.
To be honest. And look, if I had the answer to this, then I would probably be doing an even more interesting job.
You'd be doing a blog for CGD.
I think there are many sort of ways to come at this. One is that the simplicity of the Millennium Development Goals helped to define how to use ODA. Now, we knew when we evolved towards the Sustainable Development Goals that development was actually much more complex and much more multifaceted, much more multidimensional. So rightly, we had this extraordinary level of ambition, but that opened up many, many channels for things that contributed to development. And I think there were many positive examples of getting out of a very narrow definition of investing, for example, just in human development. So it was always going to put pressure on what you could spend ODA on. The second thing that happened is that public support in many DAC countries has waxed and waned. Sometimes it goes up, but given everything that's happened in the last few years, we see it in a number of our member countries that sort of spirit of the early 2000s, that our economies were growing, that this was an investment in everyone's future, is far more contested now. And we haven't, I think, had the same sort of leadership in many member countries by very strong development ministers, or seeing this as an integral part of foreign policy. I mean, there are very important exceptions to that. So what members are having to do in the DAC is to strike a balance between the competing demands created by the SDGs and, in some cases, the skepticism of politicians and the public. In others, just the argument that we can't afford this. In other cases, the argument this doesn't work. And I think the tragedy of Afghanistan was used by many skeptics to say, well, look, we poured all this money and it didn't work. So you put all that together, and you have a far more complicated political economy of development now than you used to have. Now, I know that for many, using ODA to support what are called in-donor refugee costs is hugely controversial. It was agreed in the context of the Syrian crisis, so before my time, but as a way of trying to generate resource to help these people fleeing conflict. It is very time-bound. It's just for a year. It's recurrent, not capital costs. But obviously, in the current Ukraine crisis, many countries will be using their ODA for this purpose. Now, in an ideal world, I think that resource would be additional. But given the fiscal pressure that many DAC members are under, it's not going to happen. So as ever, we spend our time trying to find a compromise, trying not to make the best the enemy of the good enough. And going back to my earlier point, trying to make the case for more ODA. But it's very difficult. And I don't think the answer is to narrow down what you can use ODA for, because ODA has to modernize and move with the times.
So that's a very interesting point that you just made at the end. You could argue that there are two ways in which you could move forward with trying to modernize and reform ODA. One is to go the route you just said, which is to say, let's adapt ODA to reflect all the needs and challenges and priorities that we have. These priorities evolve, and then you try to do the best compromise, but you stay with the one concept, which is ODA, and it's a broad concept then. And there's another route that some people propose, which is to say, actually, there are different purposes for which we transfer resources from rich countries to developing countries. One of them is what ODA was about, but then there's a financing for global public goods, climate, pandemic preparedness. Then there's also now a conversation about loss and damage, which is a form of compensation for damage already done by policies, and that better way is to recognize that these are different purposes, all of which are important, but they're not the same. And rather than trying to have an ODA that covers everything, ODA is one of the channels and one of the reasons why you transfer, but you then sort of narrow the focus of ODA, and then you have these parallel other tracks, and that's a cleaner, more transparent approach. I mean, and I can see merit in both of those. How do you think about that? The balance between those two, the pros and cons of those two different routes.
Yeah, I mean, how do I think about it? With enormous difficulty, Masood,
Yeah.
because there are no simple answers. I think the first thing to say is this is already happening. I mean, if we look at our total official support for sustainable development, the TOSSD metric, I mean, that does what it says on the can. That is trying to say there are all kinds of official flows, only one of which is ODA. If we look at the quantum of financial transfers, ODA is a small and shrinking proportion of that. So that is already happening. Now, the second question, is given that that's the case, should you actually shrink what is ODA eligible? Because there's a real risk that if you spread ODA too thinly, it's like water and hot sun. I mean, I think there's a real danger that it will evaporate. And we talked about this with our ministers at Tidewater last year.
Right.
And everybody knows that this is a real risk. However, the sort of realpolitik of ODA is firstly that partner countries are increasing the things for which they want ODA, and secondly, DAC members are increasing the things for which they want to spend ODA on. And we are a like-minded coalition of the willing, but I think and as the DAC expands, I mean, we welcomed our newest member, Lithuania, a couple of months ago. The list of things that people think should be ODA eligible gets longer. So, I mean, let me give you a really good example. Small island developing states, which of course are suffering often hardest from the immediate effects of climate change. On paper, many of them are high-income countries, but their economies are so tiny that GNI per capita doesn't really mean anything. If they get a hurricane or whatever, it can wipe out half their GDP. There's a very strong and persuasive argument amongst a number of our members that they should be ODA eligible. And I think, in an ideal world, I think that makes perfect sense. However, if you open up this rather crude indicator of GNI per capita for that category of countries, then many other countries will ask for other things. So, high-income countries with huge numbers of poor people because of inequality, and so on and so forth. The multi-dimensional vulnerability index, many, many more countries will be classified as vulnerable. Now, again, going back to a flat ODA world, you can't keep increasing the things that are ODA eligible, but at the same time, I don't think there is consensus either in recipients or in the DAC that you should narrow it down, for example, just to low-income countries or just to certain sectors.
Or for some purpose.
Or for human development,
Yes.
I mean, if you like, for the MDG agenda as opposed to the
Right.
SDG agenda. Because A, we know development is not really like that, and B, if we're respecting development effectiveness principles, we look at national development plans and they are far more complex
Yes, of course.
than simply, poverty reduction in terms of investing in very poor people directly. So, yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah.
Like most things in development. But I think what we do in the DAC is, we do have honest and open conversations about this. I know we are criticized by some statisticians for, if you like, sort of passing rules that
serve a certain outcome.
serve a certain outcome, or I think the critique most often is that artificially inflates
Yes.
ODA, but our hallmark is transparency.
Yes.
So even if the committee reaches consensus, and usually when we reach consensus, everybody is at least 20% unhappy, which means it's as good a deal as you're going to get. We are transparent about what we do.
Yes.
And I think that's one of our hallmarks.
Well, I guess in a way, the way I just listening to you, when somebody says you artificially inflate ODA, you start from some notion of what is ODA that is being artificially inflated. So you've already made in your mind some calculation of what should and shouldn't be eligible. And I guess the question is ODA is whatever you define it to be in some way around some broad definition of purpose, but with a certain element of adaptability at the margin that drives it. Now, one other point that people raise about ODA is who defines it. That this is essentially a group of donors who are defining what they classify as ODA, and it's transparent and sometimes robust conversations amongst them. But the input of the partner countries, there's been over time more effort to bring them in. But obviously, it's not they who are the ones who are defining it. Where is the balance of views in your mind in the DAC on where that stands? And I think some people are sort of saying, well, look, as long as the definition of ODA is done by the group of donors meeting in some body, it's sort of inherently a flawed concept. The definition of measurement of ODA should be done by some independent entity which draws upon the perspectives of donors or partner countries or whatever, but it's not a sort of club of donors sitting together and trying to do the best job they can with, in good faith, but it's their perspective. Where do you think the balance in the DAC lies in that conversation?
It's a very difficult question.
Yes.
And I think the first thing I would say is, there is certainly recognition in the DAC that we are a subset of donors, and there are many concessional resource transfers that may or may not meet some of the ODA rules that we set for our own transfers. So, we're talking about a small part of the resource transfer, and as I said, with the TOSSD, we're trying to broaden that tent, and that is jointly managed with the UN. Insofar as DAC members sitting together to set the rules, I think we have to ask ourselves why we do that. And that's a lot to do with accountability to our own parliaments and citizens. So if we're going to continue to make the case for this public money, we need to be able to report back to say, this is what we can and can't do with it. So that's one piece. The second piece then is, once you've done that, how do you decide how you spend it? And that process, I think, is far more inclusive as time goes on. And that obviously hugely influenced by the whole development effectiveness agenda, but also just by the way that DAC members operate in partner countries, supporting national development plans, and so on and so forth. If you agreed the ODA rules with everybody, the first thing I would say is you would never agree. There's no way around the fundamental dilemma, which is you've got to ration this resource somehow. And I think DAC members, the majority, if not all, would argue there are many, many multilateral fora where we all sit around the table together. Here in Washington, but also in New York, in Nairobi, in many countries. if you didn't have a formal setting like the DAC where the donors could talk together, you would have informal discussions, and it would be much less transparent. Recipients sit round the table and talk to each other without donors there. So I think it's not an either-or.
Yes.
And at the end of the day, DAC members take a decision that they are setting the rules for official development assistance, but that doesn't preclude others from having their own rules. They're just often rather less transparent than we are about it.
So I think that the argument that there's merit in DAC members getting together to discuss how they do business, what they think they ought to spend on, what they think the rules ought to be, I think hard to challenge that. I'd say the question that people push at is whether, beyond getting together and having a conversation, the process of actually defining what constitutes development assistance is one that should be done by one of the two groups of parties in isolation. And I mean, there isn't, I don't think there is, you can tell me if there is, but I don't think there is a sort of partner country ODA definition, where nobody puts out every year a number that says actually the real amount of ODA that went out this year was not 170 or whatever it is, but it was 135. And by our definition of what constitutes ODA. And it might be quite an interesting thing if you actually had two different sets of numbers, and then people could say, well, according to one it's this, and according to another it's that. But it's, as you say, it's quite a complicated process trying to get agreement even within the donors, because there's also a set of donors who are outside the DAC framework,
Yep.
Some of whom provide grants in ways that wouldn't go down as being eligible under DAC rules. So you could, they might actually argue the number is larger. If you go in every direction.
So you have, and look, Masood, this is art, not science.
Yes,
This is politics, not statistics. We have a number of non-DAC members who do report into the creditor reporting system. Next month, we've got our first ever meeting of a number of global providers, so DAC and non-DAC donors coming together, and it'd be really interesting to see what they say. But I think I would go back to your your alternative to the ODA measure, and I think we've got that with this total official support for sustainable development, because that, in a sense, at its most simple, gives a partner country on a single piece of paper, these are all your official flows coming in. Some are concessional, some aren't. Some are ODA, some aren't. But that's the beginning of a much more comprehensive measure. And I guess if we were sitting here in 20 years' time, it's entirely conceivable that metric, which, as I say, is sort of co-owned with the United Nations, with UNCTAD, maybe
the dominant.
Maybe.
Because at the moment, the annual number that DAC produces, the annual number that comes out on this year's ODA flows, is the ODA number. How many people do you think are waiting with bated breath for the TOS-D number coming out and sort of saying, has it gone up or down? And so the collective consciousness is still more focused on,
which is right.
ODA, and maybe over time, as you say, that'll shift.
But I also think, because ODA is this fantastically precious resource, we must maintain that profile and that interest in that number. Yes. So, and that's a political point in a way. ODA really, really matters, and particularly low-income countries really need it.
Yes.
So it's in almost everything we do in the DAC, it's about striking that balance between continuing to make the case for ODA, maintain the profile, realize its sort of properties of alchemy almost, versus the fact that it is, a critical but declining proportion of the overall resource flow. I would not be in favor of in any way downgrading the significance of the ODA figure, because it puts pressure on communities and societies to continue investing in the Sustainable Development Goals.
I mean, critical and declining, but also in some ways the demands on it from things that we didn't think of as being the purpose of ODA are growing. And although every time we do a pandemic preparedness fund or we talk about adaptation, now we talk about loss and damage, we always start off with a sentence that says, this should not come at the expense of ODA and shouldn't divert. When we look back, a lot of the funding that goes into these things is classified by people as ODA. So the demands are growing for the reasons that we've outlined. So you've got a successor coming on board, Karsten Starr. Now, you write the proverbial letter to your successor. What's your advice to him?
Okay, well, the letter won't say there's no money left. Karsten doesn't need advice from me. He's a very experienced diplomat and development professional. But the DAC, like most of the multilateral system, you need strategic patience. And I think if I look back over the last 4 years, we've had a lot of things land on our agenda that we didn't know were coming, as has everybody else. I think looking at the next sort of 3 or 4 years, I genuinely believe there is a real moment that we have to grasp about multilateral reform. Starting perhaps with it's the World Bank that's getting all the attention, but it's not just the World Bank, it's the UN as well, because the DAC is funding, I think we funded 89% of the last IDA replenishment, 80% of the UN development system. So for all the pressure on ODA, we are funding most of it. And what I would like is, for the committee to really help make sure that this moment that we have, partly created by these multiple crises, partly by some very important political leadership, the Bridgetown Initiative. We have President Macron's summit in Paris this June. We have a real head of steam, I think, and I sense it here in Washington. I'm going to New York. I will pick it up there. Certainly the Secretary General and DSG Mohammed are very, very focused on this. And, the DAC needs to play its part. And the stakes are very high. We have to, remind and enthuse everyone that development is investment. Yes. And development it's fundamentally political. And important as counting is, important as definitions are, important as all the things we've talked about are. At the end of the day, we do this to have better development outcomes for poor people in poor countries, and that is an urgent political agenda.
Well, Susanna, first of all, I want to thank you for being here today, but I really want to thank you for the leadership that you've provided in the DAC for the last 4 years. And I'm going to go further and say for the leadership that you've provided in development cooperation more broadly for many, many more years in many different roles. And you still got a month to go in this role, but I do want to wish you all the best for what comes after. And hope we'll have a chance to continue this conversation in different ways as time goes on. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Masood, for your kind words, and we will continue talking for sure.